$100, and you take her right now, Sandra said, her voice entirely devoid of warmth, treating the little girl standing beside her as though she were nothing more than an abandoned piece of second-hand furniture left out on the curb. The man sitting on the concrete bench near the bustling Greyhound transit terminal in downtown Chicago slowly raised his head, his weathered face shadowed by a heavy graying beard that matched the frayed collar of his worn denim work jacket. His work boots were scuffed down to the raw leather. An old canvas rucksack rested against his knee, alongside a half-empty bottle of spring water, and a simple brown paper bag containing 2 deli rolls lay untouched beside him. 9-year-old Helen clutched the worn straps of her blue backpack with trembling fingers, her small knuckles turning white as she looked up at the woman who had taken over their household after her father passed away just 7 months earlier. Sandra did not bother looking down at the child, her eyes fixed firmly on the stranger as she repeated that Helen had nowhere else to go, and that 2 people living on the cold pavement could easily look out for one another. The man in the tattered clothes did not flinch, nor did his expression reveal the shock that any ordinary passerby on West Harrison Street would have felt upon hearing a child offered for a single bill. Instead, his dark, calculating eyes seemed to be measuring every breath Sandra took, assessing the cold calculation in her posture as if confirming a long-standing suspicion rather than witnessing an unthinkable act of cruelty. Slowly reaching into the deep interior pocket of his heavy coat, he produced a crisp $100 bill between 2 steady fingers, holding it out without rising from the bench. He asked in a gravelly, deliberate tone if her departure would be permanent the moment the paper changed hands, to which Sandra snatched the bill from his grasp before the question had even finished echoing against the concrete wall. She shoved the money into her leather purse, muttering that whatever happened next was entirely his problem. Ignoring Helen when the girl pleaded about their promise to buy school notebooks and pack up the remaining clothes left behind in the apartment. Helen stood frozen as Sandra stepped toward the curb, that final, dismissive remark cutting deeper into her spirit than the cold wind sweeping off Lake Michigan. When the girl took 2 desperate steps forward and called out for her stepmother, Sandra turned around only long enough to snap that their connection was severed forever, because the only man holding them together was buried 6 feet under the earth. A waiting rideshare vehicle pulled up to the yellow line, the passenger door slammed shut with a hollow thud, and within seconds the red taillights dissolved into the heavy morning traffic heading toward the expressway. Helen did not shed a single tear. She simply stood on the damp sidewalk, unshouldered her faded blue backpack, placed it squarely on the pavement, and sat down upon it, as if holding out hope that someone would rush out of the crowd to announce that this had all been a terrible, twisted joke. The bearded man remained seated, keeping a respectful distance of nearly 6 feet between them, while the hiss of air brakes and the rumbling engines of cross-country buses filled the chilly air. "My name is Arthur," he said softly after several long minutes of silence, watching the little girl stare at the oily puddles reflecting the gray Midwestern sky. Helen did not answer right away, but her sharp gaze drifted from his worn boots to the face beneath the graying beard, reminding him plainly that he had handed over the cash and had therefore purchased her just like any piece of merchandise. Arthur rubbed his stubbled jaw, admitting with dry honesty that when phrased in such stark terms, his defense sounded completely indefensible, which caused Helen to furrow her brow in the first reaction that resembled curiosity rather than sheer terror. Reaching into his paper bag, Arthur pulled out a neatly wrapped ham and cheese roll and set it gently on the wooden slat between them, asking if she was hungry. Although Helen insisted she was not, her stomach let out an audible, rumbling protest that made Arthur glance down at the bread, remarking quietly that her body seemed to hold a very different opinion on the matter. Helen stared suspiciously at the sandwich, demanding to know if he had placed anything dangerous inside before she would even consider touching it. Arthur looked down for a brief, somber moment, realizing that her deep skepticism spoke volumes about the quiet neglect and hostility she had endured in her home over the previous months. Without arguing, he peeled back the paper, broke the roll cleanly in half, took a deliberate bite from one portion, and set the other piece back on the bench. He pointed out that if there were any poison inside, they would both be suffering the consequences together, acknowledging with a faint shrug that while his reasoning was unconventional, it was the best reassurance an old man could offer on an empty stomach. Helen hesitated for a few seconds, her pride battling her hunger, before she reached out and took the bread, chewing slowly while keeping her eyes locked onto his face. As the little girl ate, Arthur casually shifted his gaze across the four-lane avenue toward a newsstand where a man in a navy blue windbreaker stood leaning against a magazine rack, pretending to scroll through a smartphone. Arthur gave an almost imperceptible nod, a subtle tilt of the head that was answered immediately by a matching gesture from across the street. Helen caught the exchange instantly and asked Arthur point-blank if he knew the man in blue, watching his expression intently when he paused a fraction of a second too long before claiming he had merely seen the stranger around the station before. Helen chewed more deliberately, telling him plainly that he was lying because her late father used to tighten the corners of his mouth in the exact same manner whenever he was trying to hide the truth. Arthur looked back toward the street, realizing that in less than 15 minutes, a perceptive 9-year-old child had already detected a crack in an operation that had taken weeks of meticulous planning. Official records and corporate press releases indicated that Arthur Vance, the chief executive and majority shareholder of Vance Industrial Holdings, was supposed to be in Washington attending a high-level private conference with infrastructure investors. Financial publications often referred to him as one of the wealthiest industrialists in the country, a title Arthur thoroughly despised because it implied that balance sheets and stock portfolios could somehow summarize the character of a human being. During that particular week, Arthur had deliberately discarded his tailored wool suits, his private driver, and his executive schedule for a personal inquiry that not even his corporate board fully understood. Over the preceding 4 months, charitable legal foundations affiliated with his family office had flagged alarming irregularities involving trusts, fraudulent guardianship claims, and the systematic draining of private accounts tied to the late engineer Richard Davis. When the names of Helen Davis and Sandra Davis appeared on the investigative dossiers, Arthur felt compelled to witness the situation firsthand, never anticipating that he would watch a stepmother abandon an innocent child for a single $100 bill. Arthur knew that an ordinary citizen witnessing such an exchange would have dialed emergency services immediately, but an impulsive intervention would have instantly alerted the network of corrupt facilitators operating in the shadows of Richard Davis's estate. If Sandra genuinely believed she had disposed of Helen into the anonymous underbelly of the city, she would inevitably proceed with the unauthorized transactions she had been hesitating to execute, exposing the true architect behind the theft. When Helen finished the last crust of bread and asked where he intended to take her, Arthur replied that he was taking her to a safe house, prompting the girl to remark that bad people in movies always used the exact same line. When Arthur asked how long it had been since her father passed away, Helen whispered that it had been 7 months, her voice carrying a profound weight of grief that made Arthur set aside every trace of light-hearted banter. Helen explained that her biological mother had passed away when she was barely a toddler, leaving her father, Richard, as her entire world until he married Sandra 3 years prior. Richard had run a modest, highly specialized engineering consultancy in the western suburbs of Chicago, owning a paid-off brick townhouse and steady municipal contracts that provided a comfortable living. Sandra had worked as a receptionist in an office where Richard was once a client, and while she initially appeared supportive, Richard had always insisted on keeping the core of his estate and family trusts strictly in Helen's name. When a sudden, aggressive illness took Richard's life within weeks, Sandra discovered to her intense frustration that the family's wealth was locked behind restrictive testamentary trusts that required certified legal representation for the child. Over the subsequent 7 months, Sandra's resentment curdled into outright malice, culminating in her pulling Helen out of elementary school for the past 2 weeks under the false pretense of a chronic illness, effectively isolating the child from any mandatory reporters. As a passing commuter bus slammed its doors, Helen flinched and pulled her backpack tightly against her chest, causing Arthur to notice the fierce protectiveness with which she guarded the battered bag. When he gently inquired about what was inside, Helen insisted it was nothing, to which Arthur replied that it must be a very important kind of nothing for her to hold it so close. Sensing her guarded silence, Arthur promised that he would never force her to beg on the street corners, steal from shops, or sleep in exposed alleyways, explaining that his only goal was to ensure she was placed somewhere secure, where no one could exploit her vulnerability. Helen looked at his patched jacket and worn boots, pointing out the contradiction of a supposed vagrant offering shelter, yet she agreed to accompany him on the condition that he never grabbed her arm and allowed her to walk ahead at her own pace. Across the street, Caleb Norris, who had served as head of corporate security for Vance Holdings for over 8 years, kept his distance as he trailed Arthur and the girl through the pedestrian corridors toward an unmarked sedan parked 2 blocks away. Helen observed Caleb's reflection in shop windows, choosing to keep the observation to herself, a defensive habit she had developed during the tense months living under Sandra's roof. In that suburban apartment, Helen had learned that asking questions caused important documents to vanish from sideboards, that hushed telephone conversations ended abruptly whenever she entered the kitchen, and that locked drawers were far more telling than open ones. Just 2 days prior, Helen had discovered a small brass key hidden inside a ceramic planter, unlocking her father's desk drawer to retrieve not cash or jewelry, but a single thick manila envelope sealed with amber tape and bearing her name in her father's distinct, bold handwriting. Arthur brought Helen to a quiet, discreet craftsman home on the tree-lined outskirts of Oak Park, a property maintained by a private youth advocacy network funded by the Vance Foundation. Waiting on the front porch was Marilyn, an experienced child welfare specialist who greeted the girl warmly without crowding her space, inviting her inside to wash up, rest, and enjoy a warm, home-cooked meal. When Helen cautiously asked how much the room and food would cost, Marilyn looked at Arthur with quiet heartbreak, before reassuring the child that safety and kindness carried no price tag in that house. Once Helen stepped into the guest bedroom, Marilyn turned to Arthur with sharp concern, pointing out that an executive infiltrating an undercover financial investigation was reckless enough without improvising the rescue of a minor. Arthur countered that he could not simply stand by and watch a child be sold on the pavement, while Caleb stepped through the back door to report that Sandra had returned to her apartment, spent 20 minutes inside, and immediately placed an urgent, encrypted phone call. Caleb delivered an even more critical piece of intelligence. Early that morning, hours before Sandra met Arthur at the bus station, an unauthorized attempt had been made to liquidate nearly $3 million from an old private fund tied to Richard Davis. The transaction had been initiated using Helen's legal identity and biometric tax records, proving that Sandra and her associates were moving swiftly to drain the assets before any institutional review could intervene. In the quiet bedroom down the hall, Helen sat on the edge of the mattress, running her small fingers across the sealed envelope that her father had instructed her never to surrender until she found someone she could truly trust. Richard's parting words had been clear. If anyone ever forced her to leave their home, she was to take her blue backpack and keep the contents hidden. A directive that now felt heavier than ever as she listened to the muffled adult voices conversing in the living room. In the bathroom, Arthur stood before a small mirror, carefully peeling away the prosthetic adhesive and washing off the theatrical makeup that had disguised his features. Marilyn stood in the doorway, warning him that shedding his disguise might frighten the child, but Arthur felt it was far worse to continue living a lie under the same roof. As he turned around, clean-shaven and dressed in a crisp black sweater, Helen was already standing in the hallway, clutching an older tablet she had picked up from the side table. On the screen was a business journal profile showing Arthur in a tailored charcoal suit, surrounded by senior executives beneath a bold headline naming him one of the country's most formidable industrial leaders. Helen held the tablet up to his face, noting with razor-sharp precision that he had shaved off an entire beard in 10 minutes and had lied about being homeless, about his name, and about the man in the blue jacket who was now standing by the kitchen counter. Arthur did not attempt to manufacture an excuse, admitting openly that he had deceived her about his appearance and his occupation because he needed to observe Sandra without revealing his true resources. When Helen retreated into her room and slammed the door, Marilyn gave Arthur a pointed look, sarcastically congratulating the chief executive on his interpersonal finesse. Arthur walked into the small fenced backyard and approached the open bedroom window, speaking through the screen in a calm, measured voice to assure Helen that he would not block her path if she decided to leave through the front door. He explained that he possessed wealth and companies, that Caleb worked under his direct employ, and that his investigation had begun because millions of dollars rightfully belonging to her late father were being systematically plundered by corrupt individuals operating behind Sandra's demands. Helen stood by the sill, her expression guarded, as she asked whether Arthur was pursuing the money for his own gain, noting that her father had always warned her that wealthy men were constantly searching for ways to acquire more. Arthur chuckled softly, replying that Richard sounded like a remarkably shrewd man who would have given him a run for his money in any corporate boardroom. When Arthur explained that Sandra had attempted to move vast sums using Helen's identity before abandoning her, Helen asked the pivotal question that stopped both Arthur and Marilyn in their tracks. If Sandra needed her signature to access the estate, why would she discard her at a bus terminal? The realization struck Arthur with chilling clarity. Sandra had not abandoned Helen merely out of spite, but because the conspirators had already extracted whatever authorization they needed and required the real child to vanish, so that an impersonator or fraudulent proxy could finalize the massive transfer without interference. Across the city, in an upscale high-rise apartment near the Gold Coast, Sandra met with Marcus Foster, a disgraced former financial consultant who had managed auxiliary partnerships for Richard Davis a decade earlier. Marcus was a sharp, calculating operator who had spent the last 3 months exploiting Sandra's greed, manipulating her ignorance of commercial law to construct fraudulent transfer documents. Standing in the living room with his trench coat still on, Marcus revealed with cold fury that the $3 million wire transfer had been flagged and frozen by institutional compliance officers requiring secondary identity verification. When Sandra panicked, insisting that she had followed his exact instructions by handing Helen over to an anonymous vagrant to clear the way, Marcus pulled up a high-resolution photograph of Arthur Vance on his smartphone, his face draining of color as he realized that the man Sandra had casually dismissed at the station was the head of an industrial empire. Marcus gripped Sandra's wrist, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as he explained that Vance Holdings had acquired the parent technology enterprise that Richard Davis originally helped establish over 11 years ago. The $3 million Sandra had been chasing was merely the liquid surface of a massive legacy equity stake that had compounded quietly within private corporate holdings, now valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Marcus demanded to know where the sealed personal dossier was, realizing that if Richard had given Helen the original founding certificates and restrictive covenants, Arthur Vance would soon hold undeniable proof of structural fraud. When Sandra tore through the apartment only to discover that the key was missing and the desk drawer sat empty, the realization dawned on her that the quiet 9-year-old she had treated like a burden had walked away with the single most dangerous piece of evidence in the entire city. Later that evening, after the Oak Park house had grown quiet, Helen sat cross-legged on the floor of her room and gently pulled the manila envelope from beneath her pillow. The amber tape was brittle with age, and across the front, her father's handwriting read clearly, "For Helen, deliver only when you are safe." In the living room, Arthur remained awake at the dining table when his phone chimed with a priority report from Caleb, who had spent the last several hours digging through archival corporate filings from over a decade ago. Caleb revealed that 11 years prior, Richard Davis had been an essential co-founder of Davis Vance Systems, an advanced industrial automation firm that was subsequently integrated into Vance Holdings. When Richard departed following strategic disagreements, his retained equity was placed into a protected blind trust intended to convert into direct voting shares upon his death or when his sole heir reached adulthood, an asset base that had grown exponentially to over $400 million. A soft creak in the floorboards made Arthur look up, finding Helen standing in the doorway in her flannel pajamas, holding the thick envelope against her chest after overhearing Caleb's voice through the speakerphone. She walked over to the table and laid the document between them, pointing out the faded initials A and V stamped beside her father's signature on the seal. Letters Arthur instantly recognized as the personal mark of his late father, Anthony Vance. Helen asked if their fathers had known each other, and Arthur nodded somberly, admitting that Anthony and Richard had indeed built the foundation of the family's wealth together before a deep rift separated their paths. When Helen offered to let him open the seal, Arthur gently declined, telling her that the choice belonged entirely to her and that she should only open it when she felt genuinely secure, prompting the girl to pull the papers back toward her chest as she whispered that danger was still lurking outside. At 20 minutes past 6 o'clock the following morning, Caleb entered through the kitchen with alarming news, reporting that a dark sedan with cloned license plates had circled the residential block 3 times during the dead of night. Helen stepped into the kitchen, holding out a basic prepaid mobile phone that had been slipped into the lining of her backpack without her knowledge, displaying an unopened text message that read, "Do not give the envelope to Arthur Vance." Recognizing that the device contained active tracking software, Caleb immediately sealed it in a signal-blocking Faraday pouch, while Arthur arranged for their immediate relocation to a secluded family estate nestled in the wooded hills of Galena, Illinois. During the drive along the winding state routes, Arthur watched the rearview mirror while Helen sat quietly in the back seat with Marilyn, her hand firmly resting on the faded blue fabric of the backpack that held her father's legacy. Upon arriving at the historic stone house in Galena, Helen sat at the heavy oak dining table and finally broke the amber seal on the envelope, pulling out 3 folded parchment documents and a black-and-white photograph. The picture showed 2 young, energetic men standing outside an industrial warehouse beneath a sign that read, "Davis and Vance Automated Solutions," their faces bright with ambitious smiles. Arthur stared at the image of his father, Anthony, looking 20 years younger and happier than the stern, burdened corporate patriarch he remembered from his own youth. Helen unfolded the first letter, reading aloud her father's steady words explaining that his silent equity had been placed into an escrow holding to prevent hostile corporate takeovers, with explicit instructions that the shares were to pass directly to Helen under independent trusteeship, completely shielded from any secondary claims. The second document was a formal covenant signed by both Anthony Vance and Richard Davis, confirming that Richard's founding stake was never to be absorbed into the general treasury of Vance Holdings. However, the third document contained Richard's handwritten warnings penned months before his death, expressing growing suspicion that a senior financial administrator named Marcus Foster was attempting to forge transfer instruments and prematurely dissolve the trust. As Arthur examined the signatures, Caleb entered the study with an urgent update, revealing that Marcus Foster had abruptly vanished from his Chicago residence and that Sandra Davis had vacated her suburban townhouse, leaving no forwarding address. Helen lowered her head, the realization settling over her that the woman who had raised her for the past 7 months had not merely abandoned her out of cold indifference, but had deliberately conspired to erase her existence in exchange for stolen wealth. Determined not to remain a hidden victim, Helen looked Arthur in the eye and stated firmly that she wanted to present the evidence directly to the federal authorities and the County Child Welfare Division. That afternoon, formal complaints were lodged with the Cook County State's Attorney and the Department of Children and Family Services, initiating a comprehensive criminal investigation into guardianship fraud and asset theft. That evening, however, the conspirators struck back when Sandra released a heavily edited video across major social media platforms, tearfully claiming that she was an impoverished widow whose troubled stepdaughter had been coerced away by a ruthless billionaire seeking to seize her late husband's intellectual property. The viral broadcast sent shockwaves through the financial markets, causing shares of Vance Holdings to plunge as national news outlets picked up the sensationalized story. The corporate board of Vance Holdings convened an emergency session at the company's glass headquarters on Wacker Drive, where long-standing directors demanded that Arthur immediately step down or publicly disassociate himself from the child to protect the firm's share price. Henry Palmer, the veteran chairman of the board and a lifelong confidant of Arthur's late father, confronted Arthur in the executive boardroom, insisting that personal crusades could not be permitted to jeopardize the livelihood of 20,000 employees. Arthur refused to yield, declaring that he would not sacrifice an orphaned 9-year-old child to appease media pundits or cover up historic corporate negligence. When a senior board member questioned whether Sandra's public claims might contain a grain of truth, Arthur bluntly revealed that he had initiated an independent forensic audit into all legacy partnerships established during his father's tenure, warning the board that any director who had assisted in burying Richard Davis's trust would be held legally accountable. Although the board voted to temporarily restrict Arthur from utilizing corporate assets for Helen's protection without third-party oversight, Arthur returned to the estate in Galena with an unyielding resolve. In the farmhouse kitchen, Helen was busy helping Marilyn stir a pot of homemade chocolate fudge on the stovetop, her spirits noticeably brighter, despite the storm raging across the television news channels. When Arthur tasted the sweet mixture and playfully remarked that they had managed to slightly scorch the bottom, Helen burst into a genuine, ringing laugh that echoed through the warm room, marking the first time since their meeting at the terminal that she had completely let down her guard. Sitting down beside her, Arthur confessed that his own father had been a brilliant engineer, but an emotionally distant parent who often made unilateral decisions under the misguided belief that hiding the truth was the only way to protect his family. Helen listened thoughtfully, pointing out with childlike clarity that Arthur was exhibiting the exact same stubborn behavior by attempting to shoulder the entire corporate and legal burden alone. Their conversation was interrupted by an incoming dispatch from Caleb, who had uncovered a second internal ledger hidden deep within the archived files of the original Davis-Vance partnership. The records proved that after Anthony Vance's sudden death, Marcus Foster had utilized forged authorizations to alter the equity register, diverting dividend payments totaling over $800,000 directly into offshore accounts controlled under Sandra's maiden name. Helen sat silently as the numbers were read aloud, absorbing the chilling reality that her stepmother had received nearly $1 million stolen in her name, only to turn around and sell her on a concrete sidewalk for a single $100 bill. 2 days later, an unexpected encrypted call came through to Arthur's private line from an untraceable prepaid device, with Sandra's trembling voice on the other end, asking for terms of surrender. Panicked and terrified after Marcus Foster had abandoned her without financial support, Sandra offered to provide photographic proof of an ancient agreement signed by Anthony Vance in exchange for immediate physical protection from her former co-conspirator. Caleb arranged an immediate tactical rendezvous at a crowded highway travel plaza off Interstate 90, stationing plainclothes protection officers throughout the perimeter, while Arthur monitored the operation from a command vehicle. When Caleb approached Sandra inside the brightly lit diner, she handed over a burner phone displaying a photograph of a handwritten memorandum drafted 17 years earlier by Anthony Vance. The document revealed that Anthony had temporarily shielded Richard's equity within a private parent holding to protect it from an aggressive corporate takeover, explicitly mandating that the entire position be restored the moment Richard requested or upon Helen reaching adulthood. Before Sandra could finish explaining how Marcus had obtained the file, a dark SUV accelerated violently across the parking lot, forcing Caleb to pull Sandra behind a concrete pillar just as the vehicle sped away into the interstate traffic. Realizing that Marcus was willing to eliminate any witness who could connect him to the forged instruments, Sandra broke down completely, agreeing to enter protective custody and provide full state's evidence against Marcus Foster and any corporate insiders who had facilitated the embezzlement. Back at the Galena estate, Arthur reviewed the timeline with his legal team, realizing that Marcus had possessed intimate knowledge of their movements from the very beginning. Helen stepped into the study and recalled that on the morning of their departure from the apartment, Marcus had visited Sandra and specifically confirmed whether Helen was carrying the faded blue backpack. Helen revealed that her father had carefully sewn a concealed canvas lining into the bottom of the bag, which explained why Marcus had failed to locate the envelope during his hurried search of the apartment. With the forensic evidence mounting, Arthur realized that Marcus was not operating as an isolated rogue consultant, but had been acting with the quiet complicity of someone situated at the very pinnacle of Vance Holdings. A deeper audit of the legacy transfer covenants revealed that the fraudulent filings had been countersigned by a corporate trust entity that was formally dissolved 6 years earlier under the direct authority of Henry Palmer, the board chairman. When Arthur confronted Henry in a private conference suite at a neutral law firm in Chicago, Henry admitted with bitter resignation that he had discovered Marcus's initial discrepancies over a decade ago. However, fearing that exposing the fraud would destroy the public offering of Vance Holdings and trigger catastrophic regulatory penalties, Henry had chosen to bury the documentation, effectively allowing Marcus to blackmail the executive suite for years, while Richard Davis's rightful equity remained locked in limbo. Henry looked at Arthur with tired, defeated eyes, arguing that Anthony Vance had originally concealed the partnership structure not out of corporate greed, but out of a desperate desire to protect Arthur himself from being implicated in early compliance errors, when Arthur was a young, inexperienced junior executive. Arthur stood firm, rejecting the notion that an injustice committed in the name of family protection could ever justify 17 years of silence and the near destruction of an innocent child's life. With Henry Palmer's signed confession and Sandra's sworn testimony submitted to federal prosecutors, the authorities obtained emergency arrest warrants for Marcus Foster, dismantling the corrupt apparatus that had preyed upon Richard Davis's family for over a decade. Federal agents apprehended Marcus Foster at a secluded rental property near Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, where he was found surrounded by counterfeit identity documents, forged corporate seals, and encrypted hard drives containing records of his financial extortion schemes. Days later, Arthur was granted a formal, supervised deposition with Marcus inside a secure conference room at the Federal Building in downtown Chicago. Marcus sat across the metal table with a cynical smirk, sneering that Arthur's father had laid the groundwork of deception years ago, and that he had merely harvested the opportunities created by the family's moral compromises. Arthur placed the original founding charter on the table, looking Marcus directly in the eye as he stated that the fundamental difference between them was that Arthur was entirely willing to sacrifice his corporate standing and personal wealth to correct the past, whereas Marcus had spent 20 years destroying lives out of bitter envy. In the weeks following the arrests, independent forensic accountants and judicial trustees completed a comprehensive review of Richard Davis's original equity holdings within Vance Holdings. The court formally confirmed that Helen Davis was the sole, undisputed beneficiary of a dedicated voting trust representing 12% of the conglomerate's total enterprise value, an asset pool conservatively valued at well over $400 million. Following the completion of the regulatory review, the corporate board fully reinstated Arthur as chief executive, while Henry Palmer quietly resigned from all public and private directorships to face pending civil and regulatory sanctions for his decade of concealment. Sandra Davis pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy and child endangerment charges, receiving a custodial sentence that reflected her full cooperation with the government's prosecution of Marcus Foster. Before her transfer to a correctional facility, Helen requested a single supervised meeting in an administrative conference room at the County Social Services Office, accompanied by Arthur and Marilyn. Sandra sat across the table, stripped of her former vanity and arrogance, her voice trembling as she attempted to articulate the toxic mix of jealousy and insecurity that had driven her to view an innocent 9-year-old child as an obstacle to her financial security. When Sandra broke down in tears and confessed that selling Helen for $100 had been an act of monstrous desperation born of a desire to assert control, Helen listened with calm, steady maturity, stating quietly that while she might someday find peace with what had occurred, forgiveness did not mean allowing a dangerous presence back into her life. Following the conclusion of the legal proceedings, Helen was placed under the legal guardianship of Arthur Vance through a carefully supervised private adoption process approved by the family court. Arthur purchased and fully restored Richard Davis's original suburban home, preserving every workshop tool, family photograph, and childhood memento so that Helen would never lose touch with her roots. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur arrived at the gates of Helen's new elementary school in a simple sedan, dressed in an ordinary wool sweater and jeans, waiting patiently among the other parents as the dismissal bell rang across the playground. Helen emerged from the double doors, her beloved blue backpack resting comfortably on her shoulders, running across the lawn with a radiant smile that completely erased the shadow of the transit terminal where their journey had begun. As they drove along the tree-lined avenues of the western suburbs, with the golden sunlight filtering through the turning leaves, Helen looked out the window and remarked playfully that Arthur was finally looking like a regular father, rather than a distressed wanderer or an imposing corporate titan. Arthur smiled warmly, acknowledging that learning to listen to a perceptive 9-year-old had taught him more about integrity, humility, and authentic leadership than 4 decades spent navigating the highest corridors of American commerce. Helen adjusted her seatbelt, reminding him that when reporters eventually asked about how they met, he should simply tell them that a little girl with a blue backpack had given him the toughest negotiation of his entire life, a truth Arthur gladly promised to honor for as long as he lived. True human wealth is never measured by the valuation of corporate portfolios, the balance sheets of multinational enterprises, or the material comforts accumulated over a lifetime of professional ambition. The most profound currency in this world resides in the quiet, unyielding commitment to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to honor the promises made to the departed, and to confront the uncomfortable truths of our own history with absolute transparency. Life has a way of testing our character not during moments of effortless success, but in the obscure, forgotten intersections of daily existence where no cameras are watching, where social status dissolves into insignificance, and where a single choice between cruelty and compassion can alter the destiny of generations. We often spend decades constructing elaborate justifications for our compromises, convincing ourselves that silence is prudence and that self-preservation justifies looking away from the suffering of others. Yet a single act of genuine courage can dismantle years of deceit and restore the moral equilibrium of an entire family. When we look back upon our journey through the years, we realize that the people who leave the deepest imprint upon our souls are rarely those who offered polished words or convenient alliances, but those who stood beside us in the cold, raw moments of vulnerability when our world had completely collapsed. Grief and betrayal have the power to harden the human heart, tempting us to view the world through a lens of bitter cynicism, yet the innocence and resilient spirit of a child can remind even the most weary adult that redemption remains possible whenever we choose justice over pride. To build a lasting legacy requires far more than leaving behind financial inheritances. It demands that we pass down the enduring virtues of honesty, empathy, and the willingness to sacrifice our own comfort for the dignity of another human being. In the end, the measure of a life well lived is found in the quiet peace of knowing that when circumstance presented an opportunity to restore what was broken, we did not turn our backs, we did not count the cost, and we chose to stand firmly on the side of love, truth, and human kindness.